So many people have been speaking about the climate crisis, but the real question is, why is it that we're still not acting at the scale and speed that is necessary?
For 150 years, we built up a world based on the assumption that we can exploit the planet for free, and it translates to very dramatic impacts happening right as we speak.
The climate crisis is a threat multiplier, which means it exacerbates existing inequities in our society.
We need to remember we're on the same planet, and this is the planet that we need to make sustainable for the whole of humanity.
Making much faster progress toward all 17 Sustainable Development Goals is the best pathway to a just future for all, and public-private partnerships will be absolutely crucial to this transition.
We know that this transition will require a fast adoption of a lot of new technologies, and the question today is how to find the appropriate way to finance this technology.
Younger generations are demanding a sense of purpose. They want to look at companies and say, I am investing with you all for this reason.
The solutions are there. What we need is governments to regulate, to invest, and we need business to act with values.
History will look at us, people, politicians, corporate leaders. These times requires not only solutions, but speed.
There is nowhere else to look than the mirror. We are the ones that need to do this.
Hi, and welcome to the World Economic Forum's panel on automation and augmentation, the AI workforce. We've got a fascinating group of people here to talk about a fascinating topic. 45 minutes will definitely not be enough for what we're going to get to today. But let me start out by introducing our panelists, and then we'll go through a brief introduction of some fascinating new research that the World Economic Forum has put out, and then we'll dig into this in some depth. First, we've got Bob Moritz, who's the global chairman of PwC USA. Next to him is Paula Ingabire, the Minister of Information, Communication Technology and Innovation in Rwanda. And then at the end, we have Mark Garnberg, who's the Managing Director of Zeta Venture Partners. Thank you. Folks, before we get started, I'm just going to quickly summarize some World Economic Forum research that just came out talking about this. We'll see a graphic on screen shortly, no doubt that will summarize some of this. But we'll start out by saying that according to the World Economic Forum's Future of Jobs report, 25% of all jobs will undergo some measure of change in the next 5 years because of AI. There will be new job opportunities, but there will be disruptions and losses, and net, it looks like there will be a positive impact. LLMs will benefit jobs that prioritize critical thinking and problem solving, and we're going to see on screen now the kinds of jobs that will benefit, that have the highest potential for augmentation and the highest potential for automation. And we can see how these kinds of break down. Things as the WF report puts out, anything that's routine, repetitive, language-based, those tasks will definitely be disrupted. The things that prioritize critical thinking, complex problem solving, those are the things in which AI can really serve an augmentation function. And I think one of the big takeaways from this report was that governments, companies, everybody needs to be proactive. Being reactive is possibly the most dangerous thing that anybody can do in this kind of transformative moment. So let's dive right in. Mark, why don't we start with you? Your VC focuses on AI. That's the thing that you invest in exclusively, I believe.
That's correct.
Set out the opportunity set. Well, what are the opportunities in this moment as you see them?
So we started 10 years ago, and what's interesting is that for 10 years, the technology has been growing. We've been investing in machine learning, deep learning, now generative AI, both infrastructure and applications. And what's interesting is that the market just took off after last November. So ChatGPT came out. It was the fastest growing product in history, I think 100 million users in 2 months. And now it's captured the mindset of people, and that's thrust us to bring this technology in. So one of my favorite stories, by the way, is I was on a panel at MIT with North American Stainless, which is in Kentucky, and they had not brought AI in, and then their workers came, after ChatGPT came out, their workers came into the office, the machine line workers, and said, hey, where's the AI? We're at home working with our children on their homework using ChatGPT. And so that's, I think, thrust this forward. In terms of the opportunities, I think it's for investors, it's in infrastructure, it's in applications, and in data infrastructure as well. And the applications are radically changing. So, for example, we've been investing in AI native life sciences. So we're now not discovering drugs, we're designing drugs. So, I think there's 400,000 proteins known to man, but the pool of potential proteins is like 10 to the 1300th. And so we can now create drugs using AI, essentially a protein language model, by the way, that predicts the next protein. We can use AI to design very specific drugs for forms of cancer. So I'm very optimistic about what the future holds in those areas.
And Paul, just before we came on, you also voiced that kind of sense that we should be optimistic. We sort of over-index on the fears. Can you go into that a little bit further?
So yes, thank you. I think a couple of things. I hear all the fears. I think it's also safe to say that we need to be very reasonable enough with what exactly are the pros and cons of even starting with AI. So some of the fears are around job displacement. What are those jobs that are going to be displaced? And I think you gave us a great layout of what are those possible jobs that are going to be replaced and which ones are up for more efficiencies. I think the key question is really going back and understanding if these jobs are going to be displaced, how do we skill the workforce going forward so that they take full advantage of those that are going to be augmented? The reality is no one in today's digital world, you no longer have to go back to do a university degree to be able to perform certain tasks. So how are we thinking about reskilling and upskilling of our workforce? How are we thinking about how the jobs are going to be disrupted, whether it's in industries, whether it's in healthcare, agriculture, to mention but a few. And then just going back and understanding how long is it going to take us, because depending on a trajectory that any country may be having or a corporate business may be having, some may be disrupted as soon as in the next 2 years, others it may take 5 years to go. And so the key question is how do we leverage the time left before full disruption happens to really skill the workforce so that they can respond. One thing that I find, and I'm quite optimistic about it, is the ability to democratize access to opportunities. And so even when you look at the jobs that will seemingly be displaced, the ones where we're worried about the effects of automation, the reality is that if we're able to put on a positive lens in how we will then see more and more people that are going to be able to be given that opportunity. Just to give you an example, about 3 years ago, at the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, we had, and you are working in the VC world, we had a startup that had to come up with an AI tool that helps radiologists to analyze. And why was it interesting for Rwanda? It was interesting because a country that has a 13 million population, we only had 13 radiologists. So imagine the workload that these 13, so basically talking about one radiologist for 1 million people. But also the ability to help them. If any of them has a workload of, let's say, 100 cases to review, how will they understand which one is the most urgent case to be looking at? Right. Because it will only depend on the symptoms that are displayed. If someone is in a critical condition, then maybe they're going to be prioritized. But however, if you had all these tools at your disposal as a radiologist, then you're able to even support someone before they get into a critical condition. So I believe really that there's definitely fears, but rather than be caught up in fear, I would rather focus on how do I skill the workforce to be able to take full advantage of the benefits that come with automation and augmentation of emerging technologies like AI.
This leads kind of perfectly into, Bob, you've sort of worked on this enormously. Can you dive in, again, before we sort of came on, you were talking about what PwC had gone through, this incredible transformation. Can you just walk us through that?
Yeah, really quickly. The reality is, as Paul and Mark said, is we have to put this into context. Technology, not just AI, was already moving us in this direction. It just had really accelerated, as Mark said, relevant to the last year or so, relevant to the generative AI component pieces of this. And we've got to be more mindful of the type of AI technologies that we're talking about here. Are there ones that are autonomous in nature that'll eliminate the routine? Are there ones that are autonomous that'll actually eliminate the creative and everything in between? And then there's others that are going to augment the work that needs to be done, that will not necessarily reduce the needs for job and labor en masse, but it's going to change radically how that labor is skilled and how they actually can adopt to it. So it's not only a replacement issue of the jobs that are at risk, it's actually all jobs that are going to change dramatically. So the 25% statistic that you talked about at the start, I think, is underestimated when you look at the challenges that are there. For PwC, we historically have been very much a people-led business. And the reality is you could no longer do all that was needed to tap into the IP, structured and unstructured data necessary to do the jobs and maintain the quality and the relevance that was needed. So how do we get our people sufficiently proficient on the use of technologies generally? And that required us to step back and say, look, for an employee at PwC, let's minimize the risk of you feeling like you're threatened. Let's figure out ways to help you upskill. Let's give you the opportunity to use those skills in new and different ways in terms of creating small innovation or large-scale innovation. And let's change the nature of the work you do and make you part of that process. Not that it's going to be led by the corporate office or from the center, but from a bottoms-up perspective. And if you give people permission to use the technologies, AI and others like it, and give them the tools to do so, and the safe environment to learn and fail fast, that's the recipe for all the upside and the positivity that's actually out there right now that we're seeing in governments, for communities, and in the corporates as well.
So, obviously we've started out with a very positive note. There are opportunities, but of course, understandably, I think reasonably, several people are fearful, and you talk about PwC employees, like employees around the world are fearful of being replaced or being sort of downgraded, any number of things. How do we start a conversation with those people as to bring them into the fold, to actually create a system in which you are actually you're talking about working together, because I think there are understandable reasons to be fearful, and so. Paul, if we start with you, you obviously have a sort of a community in the sense of like constituents who have to be addressed, workers. How do you start to have that conversation? How do you even begin to devise that strategy?
I think the starting point is one, what are we trying to address? I think once you are able to garner excitement and support around what are the benefits, what are the advantages of that, then people will be able to comfortably come out and say, but then what happens if, for example, we're talking about banking, you have, let's say, 300 tellers, and it's going to result into not even having one. So then the question becomes, and this is where employee-centric or citizen-centric solutions come in very handy, because you're not only, selling to them the promises of technology, but you're also telling them, yes, look here, in 4 years, this job will not be existent. But here's how I'm going to work with you in a journey that allows you to get the right skills so that you're able to still remain relevant to the workforce, to still be able to contribute. And once you do that, then people will be much more comfortable because they know, yes, what I'm doing today may not make sense in the next 4 years, but I'm getting the skills that I require for the next 4 years when these jobs actually come on board. Now, I think at the end of the day, what is urgent is collaboration and really having very honest conversations. I think the tendency that happens, especially with emerging technologies, is selling the benefits, but trying to ignore the fears that people have, trying to ignore or minimize the concerns that they have. And once you start minimizing anyone's concern, you've lost them. They're definitely not going to be on board. So even starting with, we know here this is the main concern, let's tackle it head on, as we think about how we transition, because we must transition, and it's not like we have a choice of not transitioning, otherwise we get left behind, and they need to look at the bigger picture. How does this support economic development? How does this improve wealth creation at a personal level, at a household level? And so really walking that journey, but also ensuring that people understand that you're not minimizing their concerns and risks, but rather, curating solutions around how they become part of this futuristic hope that you're, selling to them.
Can I build on this for a second? This is good change management.
Yeah.
First step is you actually have to describe the environment that we're operating in, and that goes to the local citizen that feels threatened. And there is an inevitable reality of the trends that are coming. Some may see those trends today, some may not, but you've got to help in the broader education for context. Number two, you got to make sure that, as was rightly said, this is not being done to them, but rather with them.
With them.
And you're co-creating something that is going to be beneficial for them. And within that, you've actually got to get to two very important themes, which is how do you develop a level of trust between that citizen, that worker, that future student, or that future teacher, or whatever the case may be, as well as describe the outcome that's going to come from that change. And you got to have trust in the belief that that outcome is actually going to be beneficial for them personally as well, as a country, a community, a corporate, or otherwise. And those are the things that are super important as we think about, how do we bring people along for the journey? And the good news here is the WEF is creating the kind of awareness around these trends. Now the question is, how do governments, business, and communities take some of those trends and say, what does that mean for us locally in my community? Because each community around the world is going to have a different set of facts and circumstances of how big that change is, the positives, the negatives, the risks, the opportunities, and everything else associated with it. And it's got to be done locally where you're closest to the people on the ground.
Absolutely.
And Mark, you've obviously invested across several different companies. You've seen several different case studies of this. I mean, are there best practices, things to avoid that you've noticed that companies do well, do poorly as they handle this with their staff and the people they interact with?
Well, in terms of the companies that these startups are selling into, right? But you have to remember that you're not creating a new worker, you're creating a co-pilot. And basically that co-pilot, like in the case of the radiologist, you're creating thousands of radiologists that happen to have a co-pilot now to work with. So you're creating that co-pilot who can get you up to speed much faster. It is the first time in history where we're seeing a change at the decision level as opposed to at the sort of worker level. And so we're effectively not really changing the jobs of the people that have minimal education, but the ones that have the most education are actually going to change the most. However, what we can do is that we can take new people and bring them up to speed very quickly. So in some sense, we focus on the idea that generative AI is going to hurt people effectively, replace them as skilling, but it really is a reskilling tool. It can take people without experience in a position and get them up to speed very, very quickly and be competitive. So if I'm in a company, I have to mentally think, my job skill maybe is good for 5 years at most. So what do I want to do next? And if you allow them to have that co-pilot, they can aspirationally keep moving to the next level. So I think the onus then becomes on the business to make sure they have a culture to accept that. The other thing I would say is that there's the whole idea of workflow design, which I think is going to be imperative in this wave. And I'll give you an example. There's a study starting at MIT, which is the work of the future for generative AI, led by Julie Shaw and Ben Armstrong. And they went to a company and they had 800 HR experts. And they said, okay, we want to bring in this co-pilot of bots to do customer service. And they just brought them in and they found that the community didn't use them. So they had to change the workflow. So the workflow change was, you don't have an HR manager now, you can go to this bot. But all the HR managers were turned into specialization experts. So you'd go to the bot first and then you'd go to the HR expert. It actually improved productivity, improved people's NPS of the system, got answers to them much faster. But it was because of this workflow change that they had to do. If they just brought it in, the technology would not have succeeded. So I think that with the technology is where we have to go to make this work.
And really, maybe just to take an example of education, I think that's one industry that potentially is going to be disrupted. I think the examples we see, and I like the point we're making here around co-creating with the people. The schools that are taking advantage of these hybrid solutions are the ones where you see the approach of, they've created a fund, a very small fund, that allows teachers or the faculty to be the one that goes out to look for solutions that they think will help them in the classroom to deliver better learning outcomes, versus schools where the administration comes in and says, here's a tool that everyone has to start using. And so because you've given them the opportunity to be part of that, then suddenly even the willingness to use and the resistance goes away. And so you see better uptake and, being able to get the advantages that come with it. So I think in all of this, it's really just going back and saying, how are we working with everyone that's going to be affected positively or negatively, and figuring out a solution that will work. And I think it will vary from one context to another.
What we're focusing on here is the combination of not necessarily just what's going to happen to work and labor more broadly,
Yeah.
but how does labor more broadly get educated over time in a much different way than ever before? And we have to recognize, and I'll speak on behalf of myself rather than the panel, the way I learned is going to be much different than the way the next generation learns. And that next generation had the ability, through the internet to tap into anybody, any place around the world. And now what the AI is doing and the technologies are doing themselves is actually pinpointing that to be very specifically augmenting that learning just in time, not 3 years earlier, for whatever is going to be needed for that interview, for that job, for that promotion, or otherwise. And so we've got to be looking at both of these things, not necessarily just what's going to happen to the labor force.
It sounds like all of you are also describing that sort of leadership will have to just fundamentally change how they lead organizations as well, because there's going to have to be a release of some measure of control, that you're going to have to allow people below the sort of the top tiers to just make decisions, to empower them with tools and have to live with the consequences. Does that sound about right?
Absolutely. I'll take this one just from a PwC perspective. You learned quickly when you go through this exercise in the change management that you have to change the culture of the organization first. You have to get leadership behaviors to be different in a big time way, and you've got to actually create an environment where it's safe to do these things, so everybody feels like they're part of the teamwork necessary to make this come to life. The two biggest lessons I will share with you that we came out of this with was giving people time to learn. So a very quick story, when I brought my leadership team together, we were up in Toronto, what I had was 250 people in the audience. What they didn't know is I had 5 people in the audience that one was a first year, a third year, a 5-year experienced person, not a leadership team member. And after the end of the 2 days talking about this stuff, I brought that group up on stage. I said, what did you think of the strategy? And their response was, we love it. Who's going to do it? Because I've got a day job to do. So when are you going to give me the time and the capacity to learn and to apply and to maybe fail and learn along the way? So point number 1 is find that capacity and get them part of the process. Number 2, middle management, senior management has a tendency to get in the way. They're too vested in what's happened in the past. So you've got to get them out of the way of the process. And again, if you need to, you either have to train them to be different leaders, or you got to pull them out of leadership roles and replace them.
Well, in fact, to what you're saying, Bob, that they can't be territorial.
Exactly.
They have to think in terms of the company, because what they're really doing by letting them do that is gain new skills, and they'll probably end up joining another group in the organization, but it's much better for the company.
Absolutely, and I do want to talk about one other piece which we haven't covered yet. We've talked about communities, we've talked about educators, we've talked about the labor force. Let's talk about government. Governments,
we should get into that.
Absolutely have to be learning this as well in terms of how they operate and interact with the society that they're responsible for governing.
Paula, could you pick that up? I mean, you're speaking obviously from that point of view. I mean, governance challenges are very different from businesses in so many different ways. I mean, how do you think about that?
I actually think the challenges are not any different, because at the end of the day, it's the same citizen. Whether you have a corporate duty to serve them, but even as a government, you have the duty to serve your citizens. And I do agree. So it starts, 1, how do you build a culture where there's continuous learning, but also where you can balance between a top-down and a bottom-up approach of how do ideas come through and how do we figure out the best of the ideas that need to be driven further. Now, I think also, just to be realistic, is what you find in most governments is sometimes the capabilities that you have in the corporate world are far from what you see within governments. And so then the question becomes, how do we build policy leaders that have the ability to work as if they're a corporate at the end of the day? Because you need to be able to balance between how do we grow, how do we not become very heavy-handed in managing processes, because I like to say I have a portfolio that looks at technology and innovation, but we've been realistic to the extent that we say sometimes these technologies, there's a very huge debate around regulating AI, and we're not going to regulate what we don't know. So how do we then balance between having a heavy hand and stifling innovation to rather figuring out, okay, how do we allow for some of these things to happen? Governments are resource constrained. We don't have all the money that we need, both in human, resources, but also financial resources. So how do you create an environment that allows for all these ideas to come through, support the cause that you have a mission to serve your citizens, at the same time understand the risk? So let me even give a practical example. We're in the process of building a digital ID for the country. Now, it's very exciting. Corporates love it. It's going to be the rail through which they can deliver better and more efficient services to citizens. And we will definitely have all these AI models built around the digital ID to ensure that we have more better services that we give. But then you have also the worries that citizens have. Then you have questions around data protection, about security and privacy. So that balance is always a tricky one, and I can tell you very candidly that you never find a one-size-fits-all. There are trade-offs to make along the process, but I think what it requires for us as policymakers is how do we then become agile enough? How do we become humble enough to understand that sometimes these things we may not understand? And that's where concepts like sandboxes, test beds come in very handy, because in a very small controlled environment, you're able to test something, you're able to listen to people. Within Rwanda, we've created policy labs that allow us to then bring the citizens together, the people who are building the technologies, the solutions, and that way we have like a wide view of perspectives coming in as we build something. We'll test it, it's a proof of concept, but we're constantly preaching that it's never going to be perfect until we iterate many times and we figure out what's the best solution. But it takes time. It takes time. It takes understanding that changes are constant, especially in a world that is heavily driven by technology, and being comfortable with that change and knowing that this continuous learning is not only going to apply in the corporate world, but even for us in the public sector, need to be very adaptive to these changes.
Go ahead, Bob. It seems like you want to jump in.
If the example we're using, Rwanda or otherwise, it comes back to two major themes. Number one, the blurring between ministers of education and labor and ministers of technology, communication, and data, blurring very much together, number one. And number two is the need for the public-private partnerships to actually bring this to life. And part of that becomes really important because, to your point, the capital is going to go to the places where you see the mesh of those two things, actually bringing that potential to the table, and therefore you'll get that investor base to bring that capital to life in the places that need it the most. And that's where you'll actually bring, I'll call it, a better opportunity for those that may have historically been left behind not to be as propensely left behind today. So if we can actually get that more programmatically into the system, I think the better off we're going to be.
So let's take it from there to thinking a little bit more deeply about regulation and how we create these kind of regulatory frameworks. Paul, you started by saying that we shouldn't regulate things we don't understand, and so maybe for a while we don't regulate AI. Let's go from there. Mark, I imagine you think about this a lot because this is a policy risk from an investor point of view. What are the kind of questions you think about when it comes to regulating AI? Do you think it's too early? Do you think it's necessary? Do you think governments are capable of doing this? I mean, where do you start with this?
Well, it's an interesting thing because people talk about the risks of AI. They talk about business risks. They talk about societal risks. They frankly talk about existential risks. The United States in general has been more laissez-faire on regulation. Europe's been very strong on regulation. China's been relatively strong on regulation. And I think that's all going to have to be resolved. But in terms of being in the U.S., I think it's a combination of the bully pulpit, being able to say how people should be allowed to move around, not to get in the way, so to speak, but also in terms of creating an infrastructure that more people can get access to. So one thing, for example, while they debate this in Washington, and by the way, I've seen this on both sides, where in the afternoon they'll talk about the dangers of bioterrorism, and in the evenings they'll talk about the wonders of creating brand new drugs. And it sounds schizophrenic, but it is where the world is today in its mentality. But the one thing that we can do, and I think the biggest risk, is that there will be a very few set of companies that can actually innovate because they have the resources available. They have the compute resources available. And in order to move this forward, we're going to need a very wide ecosystem of infrastructure, of innovation. And so, for example, there's a bill in front of Congress now to create the National AI Resource Research Resource, $2.6 billion bill, to be able to create a compute resource that's equivalent to what a Google would have or what an OpenAI has, so that universities can use that for research, so other companies can use that for research. And the importance of that is because that's what's going to lead to these guardrails, these new concepts of guardrails, trustworthiness, ethical AI, responsibility, so that they can bring that back into the products that we're developing. So we need a very wide set of users that are innovating, particularly in universities, to be able to bring that side of AI in.
Because I guess the danger. Sorry, go ahead, please.
I think the question about regulation, again, why there's always this debate around AI regulation is what are we regulating? Is it the technology or how the technology is used for different industries? Now, one may argue that the way you regulate how you use AI solutions for primary healthcare use will be different from how you regulate AI solutions that are being deployed, let's say, for disaster management. What's the sensitivity of the data sets that you're using and all of that? And so just figuring out, and I think we need to be comfortable that probably there's never going to be a one-size-fits-all model of how you regulate this, but just really trying to figure out what are the risks that come with this. And maybe a lighter approach may be starting with even standards. What are we looking for? It's responsible use, it's ethical use, and so how do we create those standards that allow for better deployment and adoption of AI solutions in a scenario where it's difficult to really understand that, to really give confidence that you've been able to regulate comfortably the use of AI in the different solutions. And so for me, that's what I'm looking at. The other thing is also the evolving nature. For sure, part of the effects of AI is going to be the complexity of cyber attacks. Right? That is going to come with how we deploy. So how do you deal with that? Is it something you want to regulate or you want to build capabilities, how to handle and respond to that? So ultimately, even as this regulation debate happens, the key thing is really understanding what is it that we're regulating for. Is there a better way to address this, not through a regulation, and still achieve the intended purpose? And I think those are the conversations, and that's the agility that is required of us as policymakers to sort of figure out what's the best way as we move forward with this conversation of regulation that no one has pretty much figured out.
My two panelists have summarized this really well. You have to go back to the concepts of regulation. What's it there for? Some was talking about having sufficiency of access. You've got to actually think about the antitrust issues that come in terms of maybe too much concentration of power and understanding of those kind of things. And then when you go to the specifics around AI technologies, to your point, how is it being used? Is it going to be for public use or is it for an individual or a corporate? And those will require much different things. And then you take another look at it if you're playing three-dimensional chess, which is who coded it, how was it coded, and how good was the code relevant to the responsible standards that we put in place. Number two, what data is it actually using? And buyer beware in terms of what data is being used, because that could give you a false positive or an answer that candidly is not necessarily appropriate for the end use of how maybe that user ultimately intended to use the leverageability of the technology that's been created. So it's going to have to go to standards first in terms of getting these principles on the table. And the hope is, although we'll never get there, is we can get a lot more convergence on those standards on a worldwide basis, because the AI is not limited by the geographic borders anymore if you're going to open it up for all information around the world. And then last but not least is going to be the security elements of all of this, data privacy and security elements that today we already have, but you're going to get onto steroids in a big time way over the next decade or so as this rolls out. And that's where national security will also come into play. That's going to be a big challenge for a geopolitical perspective.
I guess, I mean, two of the sort of underlying questions I'm curious if people have thoughts is, one, to your point, I mean, yes, the United States may be laissez-faire, but American companies have large investments in the European Union, and the European Union has shown itself on big tech, for example, to be much more activist in its policing of antitrust and to some degree. So I'm curious, how much does it really matter what one individual country's regulations are versus the fact that these will be transnational sort of AI platforms, transnational impacts? And then secondarily, how much do you think at the moment that our existing legislative base already covers what we need it to? I mean, some of the things you're describing, surely existing antitrust laws already deal with some of these kind of concerns. I imagine sort of the people in the business community are fairly sort of averse to additional regulation, and so would be sort of supportive of the notion that existing laws do what will be necessary. I'm curious what the panel thinks of those 2 points. That, one individual country's regulations largely do not matter.
They absolutely matter.
They matter.
Okay. Yeah, they absolutely matter. And just from a business perspective, we don't even have to talk about the AI. Let's just talk about climate. The reality is climate today, we're in Climate Week this week, you're seeing different rules and regulations relevant to how we use the planet, leverage the planet, and engage with the planet. It's causing businesses to do three things. It's causing them to be focused on the individual laws and regulations at the local level. That increases cost and complexity to what they do and how they manage themselves and how far they are trusted and how much risk they are at if they're not in compliance with those laws and regulations. Number two, it's causing them strategically to say, do I want to be in business in those countries because of that cost and that complexity? And number three, I want to get out of the middle of the arbitrage and the geopolitics that as a result of it comes from all of this fighting in terms of what my data privacy laws may look at from a EU, a US, a China, or otherwise perspective. Those same thing is going to happen from an AI perspective. So again, that's the realities. Even though we can all wish for one size fits all from a regulation perspective, it's never going to happen. And that's where companies have choices to make in terms of what markets you want to go after and how do they apply it relevant to the companies they go after.
And I could add on that because if you can look at two perspectives. For governments, one, everyone wants to be at par with the technological development. So if we're not talking about, this conversation about harmonizing regulations and, at the end of the day, we'll continue to play catch up and no one wants to be in that place. But then there's a different perspective for companies that are building solutions. What does scale look like? Because I like to say, even for the African continent, if we have 54 countries and each one has their own legislation, you have a startup that you need to support and they need to scale and access 1.4 billion market, but they have to navigate 54 different legislations. They'll probably never be able to scale. But also at the same time, we're talking about a technology that has a high rate of change, that if they must navigate a year of regulations every time they want to enter into another market, something disruptive is already happening. And so really, I think being able to have this harmonized legislation matters a lot in how best we can take advantage, but also how we can scale impactful solutions.
I think Paul is right in the sense that this starts with use cases as opposed to the technology, because we've had all these problems forever, but now we're able to, it's on steroids. Now it's happening much, much faster in much greater numbers, and that's really what we're dealing with. So let's figure out what that use case is, say that that's something that companies shouldn't be doing, that's dangerous to a company. The other thing is that there's just very basic regulation things that we have to have. For example, I should know if I'm talking to a bot or if I'm talking to a person. I should know if something I'm reading has been written by a bot or written by a person. I should know if something that I'm reading is probably accurate or not. I think the biggest fear I feel is that we have an election, 2024, 1 billion people around the world are going to vote. Probably half the material they're going to read is going to be fake. So how do you watermark that? How do you get that information out to people? How do you just do the basic blocking and tackling that regulation needs to do? And there will be some regulation for sure.
I think we've sort of been adjacent to this topic for a while, but I would love to talk about inequity and the sort of fears of the inequity of the fallout from this transformation. The WEF research showed that there will be some categories of jobs that succeed, some that don't. The ones that don't, more rote, more repetitive tasks. And also, there will be different geographic impacts. You talked about this earlier as well. How do we first, just to start out from a step back perspective, how do we even begin to think about this inequity? Because already we've seen in the past several years widening inequalities in certain countries have led to political fallout. You could argue that happened in the United States, in the United Kingdom, in various forms, in several European countries. What is your level of concern about this inequity, and what is your level of confidence that the sort of leadership of businesses and governments are prepared for what is about to come? Bob, why don't you start?
Yeah, a couple of things here. First, you got to look at those inequities from a centralization of power and responsibility for the rest of the world versus the citizens. And here's what I mean by that. Look around the world. You've got a number of companies, a small number of companies that can only have the computing capabilities, the IP, and the capital to actually do this in scale. And the question is going to be, are other countries going to create those capabilities, have that investment, or are they going to be disadvantaged because the economy and the benefit coming out of those companies, be it stock market valuations, asset prices, or otherwise, gets benefited. That's at a very macro level, and that's going to be important as we think about sort of these inequities. Go to the other side of the equation, which is the individual citizen. Do I have sufficient connectivity to the internet to tap into those technologies from wherever they may come? And if I don't, I'm at a competitive disadvantage. I have no chance of prosperity because I'm disadvantaged from learning, from job opportunity and my own self-fulfillment and economic stability, and any contributions to my family and the communities of which I live in. So it goes to now, what do corporates do? What does regulation do? And what does government do? And each one of them has a slightly different point of view to take in terms of where we got to go. For example, when you think about this concept of AI and technology, skilling being one of those, the Indian government right now is trying to make sure that we've got connectivity to 98% of the population, no matter how remote that may be. Likewise, many countries in Africa are trying to do the same thing to make sure, at least at the starting point, we've got the right infrastructure to allow to deal with the outcomes that impact the citizens. So this is going to require the capital that we're talking about, and this requires that public-private partnership. That's the only shot I think we have at truly trying to minimize the risk of those inequalities that are out there.
You couldn't have said it better, Robert. I think there are 4 things driving this inequity that we're discussing. You did touch on compute capacity. I think the numbers are showing us that 15% of countries globally own 100% the compute capacity that exists. So what happens to those countries that don't have that kind of capacity, but also need to do a bit of heavy lifting to have that kind of capacity? The second one is talent. I'll just give you, just even looking at Africa, where we have about 700,000 developers, and only 10% of that fraction are AI developers. So 700,000 software developers for a 1.4 billion market, and only 10% focused on that. So how do we build that talent? Because I feel like talent is the biggest thing that can sort of even close on that gap. You talked about infrastructure, broadband infrastructure. We have 2.6 billion people that still remain unconnected. Over 80% of that portion is in developing countries. So how do you close that gap of access, basic access? And then the last one, which you talked about, is capital. Not many countries have the funds, the capital, to invest in R&D muscle. And if you're not investing in R&D muscle, you're not going to be able to build context-specific, targeted type of solutions that respond to your problems. And so those 4 things, if we're not addressing them head on, then I think the gap will just continue to widen over time. Now, if you have the money, you can fix the infrastructure, you can sort of invest, but R&D takes time. You can, focus on compute capacity. Talent, for me, is what is going to take so much time. But again, money follows talent. So if you don't have the people, most likely you're not going to attract the venture capital. So it's really a chicken and egg. But I think those 4 buckets, if we're able to look at them in terms of if we want to tackle the issue of inequity head on, is how we address the 4 buckets in parallel.
Mark, do you have any additional thoughts on this?
I think it's imperative on the governments of every countries around the world to bring this infrastructure in, to basically try to close this digital divide, try to find a way to use their budgets to do that, because the thing that I'm optimistic about is their youth will rally around this technology. It makes them brilliant very quickly, which could never have been done before.
Yes.
So if you have that infrastructure in place for them, they can make your country wealthy beyond its dreams. And it's just a matter of them embracing what you put in front of them.
Can I build on one thing that Mark said here? I want to make sure that we're holistic in thinking about infrastructure.
Yeah.
Because if you think about these large organizations that have the computing power, they need access to energy.
Right.
They need access to fresh water to cool down the many servers that are out there.
Right.
Now let's connect the dots to climate and energy transition as well. So when you think about infrastructure, it's not just about having the capital to put in, the coding system for broadband use. It's actually all of the other things that are needed. And that's where we got to look at the whole system.
Right.
And that's where it connects the dots between inequity, education, technology, and climate all together as we think about the world that we're dealing with right now.
And if we bring it, we're sort of running out of time. So I have a thought that sort of niggles me all the time, which is, I have a young daughter, and I'm hoping that she will one day be employed. And so how do we even begin to think about training and educating, 5, 6, 7-year-olds? What are the kinds of things, what are the principles that you think about as to how we should build an education system that is ready for what is about to come, and preparing them for a workforce that will look nothing like the one that we currently occupy? Paula, why don't you start? I mean, this is something that must occupy you a lot.
I'm trying to see how I frame my answer. One, creativity and problem-solving skills are very essential at a very young age. And so I think we shouldn't lose focus of that in how, and I think it will be an important soft skill in navigating this very complex but also uncertain future that we're all talking about. Now, when it comes to technologies like AI, I think the foundation and basic skills are going to be around math. So how do we teach math? How? Because for a 6-year or 7-year-old daughter, it may be complex to think about AI, but if you start with the math skills that are really critical to how we then, over time, along the education continent, they're able to translate these skills, I think is very important. But ultimately, you mentioned how do you hope your daughter can be employed. I hope my daughter and my son can create employment opportunities. So, and it's really the problem-solving skills, it's the creativity that will allow them to sort of navigate this.
Bob, you run a 325,000 strong workforce. I mean, what do you think about this?
Two basic themes. Learn to learn. The world is going to change so radically that you've got to be much more in a mindset of always learning and then applying that learning. So when we talk about these technologies, it's not just about the coding of them. So the math is important, the coding and capability is important, but the adaptability and the use of them is equally as important. But the ability to throw them out tomorrow because the next one's coming the next day is going to be equally important. So the adaptive skills, I think, are so important. And then the basic concepts of a global IQ and agility is going to be really important in the world that we're living in, because if we're serious about where this could go, and I do think it's very optimistic and very positive in terms of the impact, it actually shrinks the world even further than we have. And you got to actually make sure that we're mindful of that world that we're living in. And second, you got to be able to move with speed and demonstrate you can actually navigate that world, be successful in that world, and continue on in that world.
I think the other thing is that we talk about this being an AI revolution, but it's really a UI revolution. They speak our language. The computers speak our language now for the very first time. They speak the language of a 7-year-old. So a 7-year-old now can get in front of a computer and basically their curiosity can take them anywhere. I think it's the most amazing time in history for children to be able to learn.
That's a fantastic note to end on. Thank you very much to the panelists. Thank you to the World Economic Forum for hosting us. This was a great discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
you.